Hello and welcome to Ohio EPA's public meeting and webinar about the 2020 Draft Integrated Report. My name is Mary McCarran and I'm hosting today's public meeting and webinar. With me here in Columbus with the Division of Surface Water, our Chief Tiffany Kavalak, Manager of the Assessment and Modeling Section Marianne Mansfield, and Supervisor of the TMDL program Melinda Harris. In a moment, Melinda will provide an overview of the report. I'd also like to note that we are recording this webinar. At the end of the presentation, we will hold a short Q&A session limited to clarifying questions about the information presented. Participants may submit any unanswered questions with their written comments for Ohio EPA's consideration. We will save all questions and comments submitted during the webinar. Before I turn things over, I have a couple of tips about the technical end of today's webinar. You should see a floating control panel at the top of your computer screen. During the webinar, the sound may fade in and out due to your internet connection. If you experience problems with the sound during the webinar, either wait a moment or two to see if it is restored, or using the icon on the floating control panel, close or disconnect from the audio portion of the presentation, then reconnect to restore audio. Please use the chat feature to report or receive assistance with technical issues. We will not be using the Q&A feature in the WebEx platform, so please type any questions that you have or technical issues that you're having using the chat feature. I will now hand this over to Melinda Harris to go over the report.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the presentation on the 2020 Integrated Report. Today, we will be providing an overview of the report, including the purpose and requirements from the Clean Water Act, and generally how we approach assessment. Highlight the differences between the 2018 report and this 2020 report. Show some of the results of our assessments and the general trends in water quality, and finally, provide information about Lake Erie assessment. The Integrated Report is a great summary of Ohio's water resources and programs. We do not have enough time today to cover all of the report's contents, so I encourage you, if you have not already, take time to review the report on our website. The Federal Clean Water Act was created with the goal of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That means that Ohio EPA, as the delegated water quality agency, needs to evaluate or assess the chemical components of the waters, which means testing for parameters such as bacteria, nutrients, metals, the physical components, looking at things like the amount of shading and character of the stream bottom, and the biology, fish and macroinvertebrates in the streams to see if they are meeting our expectations. Section 305B of the Clean Water Act requires states to report on the overall status of their waters, and Section 303D requires states to list and prioritize those waters not meeting their goals. Ohio EPA combines these two reporting requirements into the Integrated Water Quality Monitoring and Assessment Report. We have been preparing integrated reports every 2 years since 2002. In short, this report is intended to demonstrate how we assess the waters, show what the results of those assessments are, then recognizing that we cannot fix everything at once, prioritize the problems found, and schedule the work plan to address the problems. To give you a better idea of how we prepare our report, I'll start with the overall process. We collect data in several project areas across the state each year. Then we analyze the data to determine if the beneficial use categories assigned to the water bodies are appropriate and if they are being met. Any water body that is not meeting the water quality standards established based on the assigned use category is then listed as impaired. Once we have the list of impaired waters, we then assign priority and develop a schedule for TMDLs or other activities to address those impairments. Based on the framework in Sections 305B and 303D of the Clean Water Act, US EPA provides guidance on how the reports should be prepared. States prepare the reports with the 5 elements listed here. The final report is then submitted to US EPA for approval. Now I'm going to go over Ohio's assessment units. In Ohio, we have 38 large river assessment units, which span the 23 largest rivers in the state. And here is a map that shows the locations of those. Watershed assessment units are based on a 12-digit hydrologic unit code, or HUC-12. They represent an average area of about 27 square miles. There are 1,538 of these in the state. The final assessment unit is for Lake Erie. There are 7 Lake Erie assessment units: the Western Basin, Sandusky Bay, Central Basin, and Island Shorelines, and the Western Basin, Sandusky Bay, and Central Basin open water units. We evaluate each of those assessment units for 4 beneficial uses: aquatic life, recreation, human health or fish consumption, and public drinking water, if the water is used as a water supply source. The methodologies used by Ohio EPA for these assessments are detailed in sections E through H of the integrated report. Each water body is assessed for up to the 4 beneficial uses that I mentioned on the previous slide and assigned a category value. Each parameter used to assess the water is also assigned a category value. The values are: Category 1. This means that the parameter or the use is fully attaining. A Category 2 means that the data that we have available indicates that some items are attaining. Category 3 means not enough data is available to assess the parameter or the use. A Category 4 means that the parameter or the use is not attaining and the unit does not need an action. Like, for example, a Category 4A means that there is impairment, but a TMDL has been approved to address the impairment. In Category 5, means the parameter or use is not attaining and an action is still needed. One of the primary tools used to address water quality impairments in a stream or river in Category 5 is the development of a total maximum daily load. A TMDL can be thought of as a pollution diet for a watershed or a stream cleanup plan. It is a restoration plan for a system that is out of balance. Revisions to state law in 2017 created a new stakeholder involvement process for Ohio's TMDL projects. We now have 5 steps in which interested parties can review and comment on documents prepared for the various stages. The dot graphic here contains the 5 steps. In the 2020 IR, Ohio EPA has identified these 4 TMDL projects as high priority to work on over the next 2 years. The assessment units addressed by these projects can be found in Section J of the report. And they are the Maumee River Watershed TMDL to address the Lake Erie Western Basin impairments, the St. Joseph River TMDL, Black River TMDL, and a multi-watershed bacteria TMDL. As mentioned in the previous slide, we are developing a multi-watershed bacteria TMDL. This is a multi-watershed because it groups together impaired watersheds throughout the state into one project. The green watersheds, or HUC-12s on this map, are what will be included in this project. The HUC-12s in dark gray will be included in future TMDL projects. In Section J of the draft integrated report, Ohio EPA will be conducting water quality monitoring in all 23 large river units throughout the state. In order to report on the status health of our large rivers to US EPA and to the public, we developed a schedule to perform a holistic large river assessment to better represent these water bodies, both spatially and temporarily. It will give us a complete snapshot of our large rivers at the same point in time, and this has never been done before. Here again is the map showing our large rivers that we are going to be sampling. In 2020, we are also going to be performing a targeted watershed survey. The watersheds are the Beaver Creek, Grand Lake St. Mary's, Mississinawa River, Wabash River, and Upper Great Miami River. This project area can be seen in the pink circle. The 2020 study plans should be out for public review and comment in March. And again, this will be for the Large River Survey and the targeted survey in the Upper Great Miami, Beaver Creek, Wabash, and Mississinawa area. And June 15th is when the field work is expected to begin. As you may notice, Ohio EPA is proposing to consolidate 98 project areas into 37 projects, as shown again on this slide. We are hiring additional resources to ensure that we continue to collect data at historic sampling levels for the foreseeable future. The monitoring schedule for 2021 will include 4 targeted surveys in the new project areas. These include the Sandusky River, both the upper and lower portions, the Pymatuning Creek, Little Beaver Creek, and Yellow Creek, Hocking River, Sunday Creek, and Monday Creek, in the middle GMR, Great Miami River, and Mad River project areas. And again, here are the 2021 monitoring areas circled on the map. Please note that this monitoring schedule is only for 2 years. We have received a lot of comments on our long-term monitoring strategy, and we will be holding individual stakeholder meetings with each of the concerned groups that we have heard from in the coming months. Now we will cover a few items that have changed since the 2018 report. In the 2020 integrated report, it's the first report that Ohio EPA has prepared and submitted using US EPA's new database called ATTAINS. The public-facing side of ATTAINS is called How's My Waterway. This app is a web-based interactive way for people to access integrated report information. Here is a snapshot of the How's My Waterway state information page for Ohio. This app is expected to be live sometime this spring. Ohio's 2020 integrated report data will be available in the app after final submittal of our report to US EPA. Here's another example snapshot from the Community tab. How's My Waterway will enable anyone to see water quality data in new and exciting ways. Not only will integrated report data be available, but the app will also pull in data from US EPA's other water program databases, such as the Point Source Discharge Monitoring data, 319 grant projects, public water supply data, and water quality monitoring data. Now we will go into 2020 results and trends. And starting with an overview of large rivers for aquatic life. Here are the top 5 causes of impairment for large river segments. Like mentioned before, we have 38 segments of our largest 23 rivers. In general, these causes can be linked back to impoundments directly, either through habitat or hydromodification, or indirectly through organic, sediment, or nutrient loading that becomes exacerbated by the impounded sections. As mentioned earlier, in 2020, we are assessing all of these segments, and this will give us a single-year snapshot of all large rivers for the first time. Now we will look at an overview of watersheds for aquatic life. Between the 2010 and 2020 integrated report, the percentage of watershed assessment units in full attainment has increased from 56.7% to 64.3%. As we continue our targeted surveys around the state, we expect the attainment status to increase due to implementation of our TMDLs, non-point source projects, and controls that have been placed on point sources. Here are the top 5 causes of impairment for watershed assessment units, or HUC-12. These causes are mostly related to landscape modifications in urban and agricultural areas. Public water supply use. The public water supply use evaluates the suitability of raw or source water for drinking water purposes. We have 103 systems in Ohio that use surface water as one of their sources, and some of these systems have intakes on multiple assessment units. We will be following up on the 5 large river access segments impaired by nitrates, shown here on the table. 3 of these are also impaired by cyanotoxins. We're going to follow up with them this summer in the Large River Survey, and we will also be able to collect additional data to complete the assessment for the other 4 units that currently have insufficient information. Recreation use. Results for recreation use assessment of E. coli data are consistent with previous reports. Bacteria sources in surface waters are predominantly from discharges of untreated or poorly treated sewage and improperly managed manure. A statewide solution under the multi-watershed bacteria TMDL is the best approach to address these impairments. Human health fish consumption impairments are due almost entirely to legacy PCB pollution, followed by mercury pollution. In recent years, the program has been targeting sample collection to fill in missing data, to complete assessments, and to delist waters that are no longer impaired. Now I'm going to be turning over to Tiffany Kavalek to give an overview of Lake Erie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tiffany Kavalek, Chief of the Division of Surface Water. We're going to go over a lot of information with Lake Erie, above and beyond the TMDL listing. This first map shows the geographic assessment units we set up for Lake Erie in the last integrated report. Shoreline units for the areas of the lake and its bays with less than 3 meters deep, and open water units are areas greater than 3 meters deep. There are 7 units altogether. In 2018, we asked researchers most knowledgeable about the Western Basin to identify metrics that would allow us to objectively and scientifically assess the open water for impairment using targets that would meet the goals set out by the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements Annex 4 Committee and provide assurance that the water quality standards are met. The method developed uses satellite data interpreted by NOAA for each algae bloom season, which is July through October, over multiple years. Since the 2018 integrated report was released, the experts that provided input on our Western Basin method have published their work in a peer-reviewed academic journal. The citation for that work is in the 2020 IR. Also, since the last IR, we have again worked with these experts to help us develop recreational assessment metrics due to algae impacts for the remaining Lake Erie assessment units. From 2018, the method each algae bloom seasons is broken up into 10-day windows. If algae covers 30% or more of the area with a specific density in 3 or more windows of a given bloom season, then we consider that season is not meeting our annual metric. The years where that happened have a red number next to them on this table. If 2 or more years in the past 6 do not meet the annual metric, then we consider the recreational use not to be met. The unit is impaired. In 2020, we've added data from the 2018 and 2019 bloom seasons. You can see on this table that each of those seasons did not meet the annual metric. This unit remains impaired. I will also note that in the 2018 integrated report, we extended this impairment to the Western and Islands shoreline units. That was the Western Islands and Western shoreline units. This was recommended by the expert panel that developed the metric based on the nature of the bloom. That association continues into the 2020 IR. Like I said before, since the 2018 integrated report was released, the experts that provided input on our method have published their work in a peer-reviewed academic journal. The citation for that work is in the 2020 integrated report. And again, we've asked to work with the experts to help us with recreational assessment metrics due to algae impairments for the rest of Lake Erie assessment units. The Sandusky open waters are, in many ways, a transition zone between the western and central basins of Lake Erie. The algae impacts to this area are somewhat different from the western basin, but generally most affected by the Microcystis HABs that are blown and washed into this area from the west. Because of this, the experts decided that a similar approach that is used for the western open waters will be applied to the Sandusky open waters. The bullets on this slide outline the same method that I explained above for the western method. The only difference with this unit is that the satellite data from the Sandusky open waters are used for its own assessment. Here's the results for the Sandusky open waters. The red numbers indicate bloom seasons with an unacceptable amount of 10-day windows exceeding our metrics. To determine if the use is met, we only consider the 6 most recent years. Here you can see that the only one season of the last 6, 2015, exceeds our annual metric. Since it takes 2 or more years out of the last 6 to be considered impaired, this unit therefore meets its use. It's not impaired. The Central Basin open waters occasionally experience early season blooms, Microcystis blooms from the Western Basin that migrate in The Western Basin has Annex 4 target blooms. We do not have that for Central Basin, so we instead focus on what an unacceptable bloom would be. The blooms in 2011 were unacceptable enough to serve this role. Using satellite data, this figure shows the percent of the central open waters area that was covered by HABs at the same cell density used for the other open water analysis. Each bar represents the maximum area covered for each 10-day window from the 2002 through 2019 bloom seasons. In 2011, HABs covered greater than 15% of the area for 3 10-day windows. 15% is shown with the horizontal green line on the figure. So in using 2011's bloom season as a benchmark for an unacceptable year, it was determined that a season with 3 or more 10-day frames exceeding 15% of the area will be considered as not meeting an annual metric. In order to consider magnitude and duration, similar components used in the other open water assessments were added. This final assessment method looks very similar to Western and Sandusky open waters. The only change is a 10-day frame does not meet our metric when 15 or more % of area is covered by algae. That value is 30% of the area for Western and Sandusky open waters. Here are the results from the central open waters. You see 2011 with the red 3, indicating the 3 10-day frames with HABs exceeding 15% or more of the area. Only one other 10-day window exceeded the 15% threshold. It was during the 2015 season. Since there were fewer than 3 windows exceeding 15% of the area in 2015, that year meets the annual metric. Following our method and using the last 6 years of bloom seasons, we see that there are no years that exceeded the annual metric. Because of this, the use is met and not impaired. The results of this analysis is also attributed to the central shoreline unit. A special assessment metric has been developed for the Sandusky shoreline because it includes Sandusky Bay. Sandusky Bay regularly experiences HABs. However, they are generally Planktothrix dominated. These algae do not typically form scums and are more distributed throughout the water column than the Microcystis blooms in the lake's open waters. Because of this, the use of interpreting HAB densities from satellite data cannot be carried out in the same fashion as Lake Erie's other units. Given that the satellite data will not be used for this assessment and that Sandusky Bay is a manageable size to sample, we will depend on routine sampling data of the bay. Like the other recreation for algae metrics in Lake Erie, components to address magnitude and duration are included in this method. Based on past monitoring and research by Bowling Green State University, 7 locations have been selected to be included in this method. These 7 sites will be sampled for cyanotoxin microcystin in as many 10-day windows as possible between June and September. The number of 10-day windows that exceed 6 micrograms per liter per season will be summarized. If 3 or more 10-day windows in a season exceed 6 micrograms per liter, then that year will be considered to not be meeting the annual metric. If 2 or more years in the past 6 do not meet the annual metric, then the use will be determined as impaired. We currently have 2 years of data for this area. You can see that the bloom season in 2018 did not meet the annual metric, but 2019 did. So at this time, we are categorizing the Sandusky shoreline as having insufficient information to determine impairment status. If any one of the bloom seasons in 2020 through 2023 do not meet our annual metric, This unit will end up on the impaired waters list. Here is a summary of all the beneficial uses for the 7 Lake Erie assessment units. I just reviewed the bottom row, the recreation due to algae. Details on all of this can be found in the Integrated Reports Section F, starting on page F-23. I will also note here that the new metrics are currently being developed for the aquatic life use assessment, the top row of this table. These will update the existing methods we have for the shoreline areas and fill an assessment gap we currently have for the open waters. In this integrated report, Ohio EPA is assigning a high priority to Lake Erie's western shoreline, western open water, and islands shoreline assessment units for impairments for public drinking water supply due to algae and recreation due to algae. Those impairments are highlighted on this table. We are committing to develop a TMDL for these impairments over the next 2 to 3 years. That concludes the presentation we had prepared. The comment period closes Friday, March 13th. Comments can be sent to the email address or mailing address on the screen by close of business on Friday the 13th. And with that, we will turn it back over to Mary McCarran.
Hello, and thank you for waiting through some of our audio issues when we began the webinar. At this time, I'm going to remind you that if you have any questions, please use the chat feature in WebEx, not the Q&A feature. We're using the chat for this webinar. So feel free to type in your questions now, and I'll wait until I get a couple. The reason you heard some microphone noise just then was because I was moving the speaker to a different location in our room, so I apologize for that. Right now, I am not getting any questions in through the chat, so we will hold on for a few more minutes. So if you have some questions for us, any clarifying questions regarding the information presented today, please get those chatted in, typed in. All right, we have gotten a few questions in via the chat. Again, a reminder, type them into the chat feature, not the Q&A feature. The first question that we've received is, you mentioned that the agency will be hiring additional resources to enable the agency to sample at historic levels. Could you elaborate?
Yes, and I think one of the other questions has to do with what are historic sampling levels, so I'll answer both of those at the same time. We have historically, on average, for the last 30 years, taken approximately 420 biological samples a year. And we've done that with biological field crews. Right now we have 4 biological field crews, and we have 2 positions posted to get us back up to 5 biological field crews, which will allow us to take 420 to 450 biological samples per year.
Okay, the next question that we have is, what is the current state of knowledge related to presence of algae and toxicity? How does algae presence impact recreation?
Hi, this is Paul Gledhill, just joining in. The current state of knowledge, Ohio is very active in researching HABs and the toxicity relating to them. The Ohio Sea Grant coordinates the HABRE, which is the HAB Research Initiative, using State Higher Department of Education money. They have regular conferences on the toxicity that relates to the toxicity. And they've come out with plenty of publications. And the state of Ohio generally looks to those researchers and that work to tell us what the state of the science is. And the second half of that question?
How does algae presence impact recreation?
So obviously when we have toxicity, when the algae is at a point where it's toxic, and then that's when we would warn folks that we've lost our use, our recreation use. What Tiffany went through as far as our listings, that's kind of looking back on previous seasons, and it's a bigger picture looking at the whole area, the assessment unit area, and for the whole seasons. And in fact, we look at the last 6 years. So when we actually look at if there's toxicity at an acute point, that's more of looking at the Department of Health data, and they'll put up warnings at beaches on a more rapid time scale.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, when you assess biological contamination, for example, E. coli, will you determine and report whether the source of contamination is human or animal?
This is Paul again. So we talked about we're going to do a multi-bacteria, kind of all of the state for our pathogen recreation or bacteria recreation impairments. The method that we're talking about, the carrying out this TMDL is going to divide up when we see higher concentrations of these indicator bacteria based on stream flow. We'll divide them out by stream flow. And traditionally what we've seen is different sources of the pathogens or the bacteria occur at different flows. So when that streams are really high, generally that's from non-point source, when things are washing off the land. And when the stream flow is really low, then that's going to be the source of that bacteria, or really any pollutant, is going to be something that comes from a kind of more of a continuous discharge, such as a point source or maybe a failing home sewage treatment system. So in that regard, we will be able to kind of divide out the sources, and we'll have a lot more outreach on that as we develop that project.
Okay, I have a couple more chats coming in. I just want to again remind people to type any questions that you have, clarifying questions on the information we presented in the chat feature. Our next question is, I noticed that the agency is still reviewing comments on the two-pronged monitoring approach. Do you have an estimate of when the agency might be responding to comments on this two-pronged monitoring approach?
Yes, and I think Melinda touched on that as we discussed. The integrated report is just our monitoring schedule for the next 2 years. We have talked about potential use of probabilistic sampling being built into our monitoring strategy, and we plan to spend the next couple of months reaching back out directly to the stakeholders who have provided us input in setting up one-on-one meetings and walking through some new material that we have.
All right, thank you. The next question that we've received is, will bacterial source tracking be used?
We're not certain right now with the multi-bacteria TMDL if we will use source tracking. Traditionally, we have not used that in TMDLs because from the guidance we've gotten from US EPA and from the feedback we've received from stakeholders, the way we look at sources of the bacteria using stream flow as dividing that out has been adequate. It's still potential. There's a lot of source tracking work happening in the state of Ohio and throughout the world. We're certainly aware of that technology and keeping tabs on it.
Again, a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat feature. Our next question is, does higher atmospheric carbon dioxide influence toxic blooms, and how? Wait, before we answer that one, somebody asked who that last speaker was. That is Paul Gledhill. He is an environmental specialist here in our Division of Surface Water. So to repeat the last question, does higher atmospheric carbon dioxide influence toxic blooms? How?
We would defer to the researchers.
Yeah, we would defer to the researchers on a question at that level. Certainly the carbon cycle plays a role in all algae, but that's more of a question that we would want to ask the HABRI group and bring in the Ohio Sea Grant.
Okay, right now I'm not seeing other chats coming in, so please, if you have any additional questions, send those in via the chat feature on the WebEx. And I will be waiting for those. We'll stay on the line for about 5 more minutes if we do not receive any more questions. And somebody just asked really quickly, is this being recorded for later listening? Yes, we have recorded this webinar, and we will be posting a link to it on our YouTube channel. So we'll make that available to all people who registered to this webinar. All right, I'm back with the additional questions that have come in. Will there be a pollution source tracking for the Lake Erie TMDL? If not, how will we be able to regulate? And another question came in via the Q&A, and that is, what is the TMDL for the Western Basin going to entail?
Hi, everyone. This is Tiffany Kavalak again. I do want to just start out by saying the Western Basin TMDL is going to be following the H2 Ohio plan and many of the activities that are laid out in the most recent domestic action plan, which comments in today. And for this integrated report, all we were doing is setting a priority and a schedule for the TMDL for the Western Lake Erie Basin. We are not yet ready to talk about what it's going to do, how it's going to be done, other than following the H2 Ohio plan. And we hope to start outreach for the TMDL this fall.
Okay, at this time it looks like we have exhausted the questions that have come in via the chat. If there are any additional questions that you might have, remember that you can submit those and your comments to Ohio EPA by the close of business, March 13th, 2020. Those can be emailed to epatmdl@epa.ohio.gov or at the address on your screens. I want to thank everybody for their patience with our audio connection issues, and please send me an email or send the EPA TMDL an email if any of your questions were not responded to during the webinar. Thank you.